One freezing day in January of 1692, something strange happened inside the Paris household of Salem village. As sleet and snow heaped higher outside their door, Betty Paris and her cousin Abigail began to twitch and twist their bodies into strange shapes and speaking in words that made no sense at all. Betty's alarmed father, the Reverend Paris, immediately called on a doctor to examine the girls. The doctor's diagnosis? The pair had been bewitched. And so began the infamous Salem witch hunt.
Before the accusations and trials came to an end, more than 100 people had been accused, 20 were executed, and 5 died in jail. These so-called witch hunts were efforts to identify more witches rather than pursuits of individuals who were already thought to be witches. Witches were considered to be followers of Satan who had traded their souls for his assistance. It was believed that they employed demons to accomplish magical deeds, that they changed from human to animal form or from one human form to another, and that they rode through the air at night to secret meetings and orgies.
There is little doubt that some individuals did worship the devil and attempted to practice sorcery with harmful intent. Worshipping Satan is something people still do as of 2021. However, no one ever embodied the concept of a witch as previously described.
The Salem witch trials and executions came about as the result of a combination of church politics, family feuds, and hysterical children, all of which unfolded in the absence of a stable political authority.
There were two fractions of Salems in the 17th century. A prosperous, commerce-oriented port community on Massachusetts Bay known as Salem Town, which would evolve into Salem as we know it today. And 16 kilometers inland from it, a smaller, poorer farming community of some 600 odd people known as the Salem Village. The village itself had a noticeable social divide that was worsened by a rivalry between its two leading families. The Porters, who had strong connections with Salem Town's wealthy merchants, and the Putnams, who sought greater autonomy for the village. Puritans were very hostile towards colonists because the colonists didn't follow the strict Christian religious and societal rules. As a result, it is not surprising that many of the accused witches were outspoken women, slaves, colonists with criminal backgrounds and prior witchcraft accusations, or colonists who had criticized the witch trials earlier.
Now, having gathered intelligence about the town of Salem and its people, let's jump into our story.
In 1689, Samuel Parris, a merchant from Boston, became the pastor of the village's Congregational Church. He brought his wife, their 3 children, a niece, 2 slaves who were originally from Barbados, one being John Indian, a man, and the other, Tituba, a woman.
The slave of the Paris family, Tituba, started meeting a group of adolescent girls from the Paris family and neighboring households in the pastor's cellar, teaching them secrets of occultic practices. The girls started behaving oddly from this point onwards. Probably stimulated by voodoo tales told to them by Tituba, Paris's daughter Betty, his niece Abigail Williams, and their friend Anne Putnam Jr. began indulging in fortune-telling. In January of 1692, Betty's and Abigail's increasingly strange behavior started running amok. They screamed, made odd sounds, threw things, contorted their bodies, and complained of biting and pinching sensations. They began accusing certain women and men of Salem of bizarre activities and of appearing in weird forms in the girls' bedrooms, flying around the room, causing them to have fits, etc.
As winter turned to spring, the townspeople were shocked at the behaviors exhibited by Tituba's young followers. They were believed to have danced a black magic dance in the nearby woods. Several of the girls would fall to the floor and scream hysterically. Soon, this behavior began to spread across Salem. In February, unable to account for their behavior medically, the local doctor, William Griggs, put the blame on the supernatural.
Pressured by Paris to identify their tormentor, Betty and Abigail claimed to have been bewitched by Tituba and 2 other marginalized members of the community, neither of whom attended church regularly. Sarah Good, a beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly, bedridden woman who had been earlier accused of romantic involvement with an indentured servant. Because the Puritans believed that real spiritual warfare could be manifested in the world, the accusations were taken seriously and the accused were arrested and put on trial.
Two magistrates from Salem town, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, went to the village to conduct a public inquiry. Both Good and Osborne protested their own innocence. Initially, Tituba also claimed to be blameless, but after being repeatedly badgered, she told the magistrates what they apparently wanted to hear: that she had been visited by the devil and that she had made a deal with him. In 3 days of vivid testimony, she described encounters with Satan's animal familiars and with a tall, dark man from Boston who had called upon her to sign the devil's book, in which she saw the names of Good and Osborne along with those of 7 others that she could not read.
The magistrates then had not only a confession but also what they accepted as evidence of the presence of more witches in the community, and hysteria mounted. Other girls and young women began experiencing fits, among them Anne Putnam Jr., her mother, her cousin Mary Walcott, and the Putnam servant Mercy Lewis. Significantly, those that they began identifying as other witches were no longer just outsiders and outcasts, but rather upstanding members of the community, beginning with Rebecca Nurse, a mature woman of some prominence. It is also worth noticing that a number of people accused were seen as rivals of the Puritans, which also raised suspicions among the reasoning members of the society.
Those who confessed, or who confessed and named other witches, were spared the court's vengeance, owing to the Puritan belief that they would receive their punishment from God Himself. Those who insisted upon their innocence met harsher fates, becoming martyrs to their own sense of justice.
On June 2nd, Bridget Bishop, who had been accused and found innocent of witchery some 12 years earlier, was the first of the defendants to be convicted. On June 10th, she was hanged on what became known as Gallows Hill in Salem Village. On July 19th, 5 more convicted persons were hanged, including Rebecca Nurse and Sarah Good. Sarah Good famously responded to her conviction by saying that she was no more a witch than the judge was a wizard. George Burroughs, who had served as a minister in Salem Village from 1680 to 83, was accused of being the witches' ringleader. He too was convicted and, along with 4 others, was hanged on August 19th. As he stood on the gallows, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something no witch was thought to be capable of doing, raising doubts about his guilt for some in attendance.
On September 22nd, 8 more convicted persons were hanged, including Martha Corey, whose husband Giles, upon being accused of witchcraft and refusing to enter a plea, was pressed beneath heavy stones for 2 days until he eventually died. North of 200 people were accused of witchcraft by 1693, but the resentment had also started rising amongst a fraction of society who viewed these hearings as inhumane, backed by no firm evidence whatsoever. Eventually, the governor of the colony put an end to these trials after prominent men and women, along with his own wife, were accused of witchcraft. In the years to come, there would be individual and institutional acts of repentance by many of those involved in these trials. In January of 1697, the General Court of Massachusetts declared a day of fasting and contemplation for the tragedy that had resulted from the trials. That same month, Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, publicly acknowledged his own error and guilt in the proceedings.
In 1706, Anne Putnam Jr. apologized for her role as an accuser. 22 of the 33 individuals who had been convicted were exonerated in 1711 by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which also paid some £600 to the families of the victims. In 1957, the state of Massachusetts formally apologized for the trials. It was not until 2001, however, that the last 11 of the convicted were fully exonerated. No one knows the truth behind what happened in Salem. The motives of the young girls themselves can be questioned. In a society where women had no power, particularly young women, is it not understandable how a few adolescent girls, drunk with unforeseen attention, allowed their imaginations to run wild? Historians make educated guesses, but the real answers lie with the ages. The Salem trials and the witch hunt as metaphors for the persecution of minority groups remain powerful symbols into the 20th and 21st centuries.